Hey everyone, Jarrett Fuller here. I have been doing this show for over 5 years and have released new episodes either weekly or every other week that entire time. And so for the next couple months, I am taking a little break. I am taking the summer off to work on some other projects and frankly, just to relax a little bit. So in the place of new episodes, we're going to air reruns of some of my very favorite episodes from the archive throughout the summer. These are episodes that either meant a lot to me personally, episodes that somehow influenced the direction of the show, or to my mind mark some turning point in what Scratching the Surface is and was. I've recorded new intros for all of them to contextualize the conversations and talk a bit about why they meant so much to me and why we're featuring them again now. I think it's going to be fun to dig through these archives again, and hopefully you'll find some episodes that maybe you haven't listened to before. First up today is my 2017 conversation with Jack Self. This episode, for a long time actually, was the most downloaded episode of the show. It was really, really popular when it came out, and it was an early episode that felt like what I wanted this show to be. Jack's work was a model for the kind of practice that I wanted to have and was trying to build for myself. And we get into all of that, but we also talk about these larger questions. We get into this idea of design as ideology, which longtime listeners will probably know is a theme that comes up again and again in the later episodes. But it was here with Jack that I think I first started to articulate some of that thinking. And I see that as a turning point sort of in the show and in my own thinking about design and design criticism. Jack has continued to be a model for me, and I've loved following his work since this conversation. He's just kind of continually putting out new writing and work and interesting provocations. If you haven't listened to this one before, I think of this as a very kind of early classic Scratching the Surface episode, and so I think you'll enjoy listening to it again. Remember, you can support the show on Patreon, where we will continue all supporter benefits throughout the summer while we are on break, including a monthly newsletter that will have new bonus interviews every single month. Until then, I will be back with new episodes in September. Thank you for listening, and here is my 2017 conversation with Jack Self. Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really great and interesting conversation with the London-based architect and writer Jack Self. I first came across Jack's work a few years ago when he wrote a great piece for The Guardian on the Google logo redesign from 2015, and I felt like he was writing about design in a way that was really interesting to me. And so I've been following his career pretty closely ever since. His career has kind of been this really interesting jumping back and forth between writing and architecture. And he currently runs the Real Foundation, which is described as an architectural practice and cultural institute that he founded last year. And the foundation's flagship publication is called The Real Review, and is this really, really excellent publication about sort of architecture and material culture and, as their tagline says, what it means to live today. And so in this episode, Jack and I talk about his background and interests in architecture and writing and philosophy, his goals for The Real Review, and we talk about the architecture discourse and what value there might be in different types of design criticism or a new type of design discourse. This was a really, really interesting conversation for me. I love talking to Jack and getting to know him a bit more. And I just really love the work that he's doing with The Real Review. And I think you'll see the way that they are thinking about the writing there is very much aligned with everything that I'm interested in on this podcast. So I'm so glad I got to talk to him and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Jack Self. I was trying to look back to figure out where I first came across your work, and it was actually a piece that you had written a couple years ago for The Guardian actually, just talking about the relationship between graphic design and architecture, it was a piece you wrote for The Guardian about the Google logo
Oh yeah,
redesign.
yeah, right.
And I was really kind of frustrated about the discussion at the time
Mm,
about the Google logo redesign and the way it was being talked about. And I felt like that piece that you had written really cut through a lot of that. And you had this great line at the end about, and I don't mean to kind of recite back to you a
no,
thing that
no.
you had written, 3 or 4 years ago. Um, you made it was kind of like a little joke almost about the name of the typeface is Product Sans, and is that some sort of
Mm,
reference about us being the product of Google?
mm,
And
mm,
I just felt like no one else was kind of talking about those kinds of things. But all that to say is that, and we can come back to that, but I came to your work first as a writer, and then with the Real Review, kind of as a writer, editor, publisher. But I kind of wanted to start talking about your background because
mm.
you started as an architect, right? Or you had studied architecture?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to kind of very briefly touch on that Guardian piece, it's immensely gratifying when something which is very important to you in an extremely random way several years later is picked up by
Right.
someone to whom you have no direct connection.
Yeah.
Because in effect, that article was very heavily edited and huge sections of it were cut out. I think they published 800 words. It was originally 2,500,
Oh,
and
wow.
and so much of the struggle was basically to retain that final sentence. And in the end, I gave up all the rest of the article and said, fine, edit it how you want, but leave that final
Wow.
couple of lines. So that for me basically was the only part of the article that I
Yeah.
really enjoyed. Um, but in terms of my background, I mean, I'm English originally. I spent 11 years in Australia growing up. I first studied architecture in Australia. Before I started studying architecture, I was working as a copy editor. Basically, in Australia, an event like 9/11 occurred at a really unusual time of the day, and a number of newspapers were unable to stop the presses in time. So their strategy after this, in the years that followed, was to employ young, inexperienced people to basically do a night shift and watch the news wires in case 9/11 happened, and then I would call my editor, and he would presumably stop the presses.
Oh, wow.
But during that time, they got me. They trained me as a copy editor, which was already kind of an amazing skill to have. And I used to do a lot of work on kind of foreign news and all sorts of other subjects like personal finance and whatever. Then I started studying architecture. After 3 years there, I went to work in France also as an architect, where I worked on master planning and as a landscape architect. And this was one of the first times that I began to have an experience or an exposure to very high levels of urban wealth inequality. I was working on a master plan that was for uniting the suburbs of Paris with center of Paris, in essence, this meant spending a lot of time in the French suburbs, where these types of degrees of wealth inequality, they're not present in Australia in the same way. And this was actually 2008, so it was just on the moment in which these types of questions were coming to the fore with the crash.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I would say that my career has very logically followed the spirit of the time. I mean, I'm very much a kind of product of whatever happens to be in fashion at one moment,
Right.
with the exception that, of course, as you move into your late 20s, your mind becomes more rigid and you tend to get stuck in a particular
Right.
way of thinking. But so, and then I moved back to London to continue working with the same firm as an architect. I lost my job because the developer of the company I was working for, or the project I was working for, went bankrupt. And I found myself suddenly unemployed in London. And I went back to architecture school. And at the same time, I became involved with the Occupy movement, and I felt that I really needed a stronger background in the subjects that we were discussing. So I left architecture school and did a 1-year MA in philosophy and economics,
Oh,
and then
okay.
returned to architecture school again. So I guess by the time I kind of and now I'm about to sit next week my final exam, my spoken exam to become a registered architect.
Oh,
So
wow.
in that sense, it's very unusual because recent projects have included things like a lot of publishing, magazine, but also books, and also I write a lot. But also curation of a couple of exhibitions, and including the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale last year. And then also trying to be an architect, and also effectively trying to work across it's a very blurred line, especially when you imagine that my background is also effectively architecture, journalism, economics, and philosophy.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because I was curious. Something I was curious about is kind of what came first for you. Was it do you see yourself first as a writer who then became an architect, or did you study architecture and then kind of get interested in writing? And it really sounds like there's been this kind of constant back and forth where they do blur together.
The real interest for me has always been in trying to understand. I mean, the reason that the tagline of the Real Review is what it means to live today is because at its core, what I'm really interested in is the contemporary. I'm interested in trying to understand the position that we're in today, not just in a kind of, let's say, passive way, but really trying to understand what the possibility for intervention in that present are. Like, what are the possible futures which are open to us?
Right.
And therefore, how can we make a kind of moral priority about which one we should pursue?
Yeah.
So there's maybe a kind of the most basic, profound, or the most basic existential question behind it is, what should I do with my life?
Right.
And in a way, for me as a personal exploration, that's a lot less interesting than how I can contribute towards the direction of the societies that I find myself within, and the specifics of the kind of time and place that I find myself in, and what agency I have as a result.
Right. I want to get to the Real Review in a second, but I have one other question kind of related to your background, and I'm interested in thinking about this kind of back and forth between kind of practicing architecture and writing. I'm interested in where. I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but where did those things come together for you? Because it sounds like, and I don't mean to kind of project what I'm taking from your story back onto you, but your interest in philosophy and economics comes from the Occupy movement. Where did that start to intersect with your architecture practice or your interest in architecture, or when did you start writing about the built environment? How did those things come together?
When I moved to Britain and I lost my job working as an architect, I had to make a living somehow. And I first got a job. My only other skill was was a copy editor. I was not a writer. I mean, I would sometimes kind of effectively write pieces, but a copy editor's job is to understand the malleability of language. And someone gives you a 500-word newswire from the US and you turn it into a 3,000-word feature piece, or you take a 3,000-word feature piece and you turn it into a 25-word tweet. I mean, this is the kind of, and this was still the days when, although of course you can kern and space in digitally, there was still at that time a very strong desire to measure precisely in M's and N's, and there was a strong typographic element to the way in which layout was done. So, and a lot of the kind of older school printing terminology, which is less and less used in newspaper production today, was that, my training, for example, was in the first course was in the difference between hot and cold type. And so when you have a basis like that, there wasn't, I wasn't really trained as a writer to express myself, but really in the kind of mechanics of print and its relationship to language. And so I got a job working as a copy editor for the University of Manchester press, and doing typesetting science textbooks and all sorts of things like this. And then slowly, basically, just hassled people until I started getting writing gigs. There's actually maybe one other. I mean, I don't normally talk about this in such detail, but at the same time, I also started reading the work of a science fiction writer, J.G. Ballard.
Oh yeah.
And there was one of his books, which is maybe not one of his more popular ones, called Millennium People, which is basically about middle class revolt. It's about a group of middle class people who say, actually, the pressures on us, the financial pressures to pay our mortgage, to pay for to pay for a private school, and so on. These are too much. We're going to protest against it. But at the end of every protest, the next day, they sweep up the street, they turn the cars back over onto their wheels, they put out the fires. And for me, this kind of idea, the strangeness of this middle class revolt seemed like a very interesting idea. And I was also very interested in a way at that time in trying to understand what this moment right after 2008 was. I mean, this is the 2009, 2010. And it's felt to me like maybe centuries don't run, 1901 to 2001. Maybe there's a bit of overlap. And in a sense, maybe, the 20th century was more accurately 1914 to 2007.
Right.
And there was a kind of overtime, because what I was feeling at that time was almost like the slack tide between eras. The kind of the Bush administration was out, the Obama administration was very new, and everyone was very excited about it, but it wasn't yet clear what the spirit of that really was going to be. And of course, in Britain, in 2010, we had a national election in which the head of the BBC reporting at the time said, the nation has spoken, but we don't know what they're saying. It was a hung parliament. There was no governance.
Right.
And what we got out of that was a coalition which imposed intense austerity onto the populace. And I don't think the people, and that's in a way where 2011, which was a very kind of raucous year around the world, but particularly in Britain, where we had riots, where parts of London were completely shut down by rioting for days.
Right.
In my neighborhood, it became very difficult to cross the city because there was such, levels of violence and shoplifting.
Oh, wow.
And then we also had the Occupy movement at the same time. There was the Arab Spring. There was a lot of political unrest going on. And in a way, I understand that certainly within Britain as a response to the fact that the hope and optimism of 2008 was definitively unfulfilled by 2010. Right. And that led to quite a lot of social frustration. And in a way, if you imagine the types of subjects that I'm interested in, they really emerge out of that 2008, 2012 period, let's say.
That actually makes a lot of sense. And as you were saying, it became clear where a lot of the subjects of the Real Review, really kind of center around. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Maybe just one final thing to add, because I didn't actually precisely answer your question, but the relationship with space. At that time, I began to realize that, as a result of having worked in Paris and seen this master planning, and then been involved in London, where I'd been locked out of the London Stock Exchange and been what we call kettled, where you get surrounded by police, often on horseback, and they prevent you from moving. They prevent protesters from moving. And began to become aware that the city of London itself was a completely privatized arena. There were no public spaces where you could protest, for example. That's why we ended up on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, because the church was literally the only public space in the city. Right. Wow. And that was the first time in which I'd begun to think about how the design of space, and if you want, the social conditions, the power relations of space, have a huge impact on the direction of quite, in a way, very abstract things, very abstract ideologies. They almost always exist in space.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the moment at which I began to understand that. And then, of course, subsequently began to think, well, if this is the case, what's my possibility to intervene in that?
Yeah.
So that's and that in a way is also what drives Real Review as an agenda. I mean, we do really focus on the material evidence,
right.
And in effect, the reason that it's a review, I think the review is probably the most undervalued form of writing today. It's a really huge category, and on one hand, you can say, okay, well, go back to the 1960s and 70s, you would have these reviews that would be things like, a review of a decade in neuroscience covering a whole discipline and period. And nowadays, of course, we have like 5-star Amazon product reviews, right. and there's a literary review in between. But the essence of the review is basically to consider something which exists in the world. Could be an idea, could be a concept, or a spatial condition, or a specific cultural artifact. and examine it in order to make a proposition. And this is very different from the opinion. The opinion can often be very interesting and insightful and useful, but they tend to be quite standalone. They don't build a discourse. And what I think is really powerful about being involved in a design discipline, or indeed any discipline, is the idea that you are building a discourse, a positive discourse as you go forward. You're not simply using opinions as a way to make these kind of flash in the pan. So the review for us is important because it first of all focuses on the material and the existing. You have to start from something which is there, and then make a proposal about what it is you think should be there, or some other type of let's say proposition.
Yeah, I think it's so great, and I want to come back. I want to connect that to something that you had said earlier about kind of space being this manifestation of ideology, and that's something that is exactly what immediately drew me to your work is that kind of mindset. So it was so nice to hear you kind of just kind of frame that so clearly.
I've never actually kind of compressed into a single kind of moment. Actually, I've never drawn that history for myself, if you want, but that. I'm a great believer in the power of my subconscious, and I assume that it's doing great work, but it's not always apparent to me,
Yeah.
But yeah, now that I've said it out loud, that is not just a kind of constructed narrative, but actually very much the truth of the situation, and that's also why I say in a way that I'm a fairly logical product of the time that I've come to adulthood, let's say.
Right. I mean, I've been reading Althusser and kind of his writing about ideology, and he has this great phrase that ideologies do not obscure reality but actually make new realities. And
completely,
just once an ideology is kind of in place for long enough, it just becomes the way the world works. And I have kind of come to realize that the way that happens, the way ideologies become the way the world functions, is through design and through the built world. And so
completely.
So when you say that the real review is about kind of what it means to be alive today and connecting that to this idea of buildings being kind of ideology in space, I find that way of looking at architecture, looking at materiality, looking at the built world, and I think you could push that all the way to my interests in graphic design, that this is a very important way to be talking about these things that in the graphic design profession aren't really discussed much. There's very much like a surface kind of layer critique of these things. How do you think about that? And that
I mean, I don't want to drift off into philosophy too much, but two things that come to mind very rapidly. One is, of course, Immanuel Kant says that ethics and aesthetics are one.
Right.
He in this sense, when you make an aesthetic proposition, you're also making a moral and an ethical proposition, and you're expressing your ideas about the world through that form, right? And I think at the moment, there seems to be a super disconnect, or an uncanny disconnect between the way in which we think about something like style and the way in which we think about something like substance and form.
Right.
And in a way, I might compare it to something like, in the early 2000s, you had mobile phones in which you could replace the outer case. The core of the phone remained the same, but you were able to customize it. And this idea of kind of applying a skin. Also, people who work in a digital world understand increasingly that the core structure of a web platform or a digital platform remains the same, irrespective of how you then apply it. Something like a cascading style sheet or something.
Right.
We understand that the style and the basic form are in a way disconnected, and we shouldn't do that, because one should logically follow from the other. Whether you select one typeface or another becomes incredibly important, both for the illusion, the conception that you're trying to pass as in your role as communicators, and therefore the vision for the world that you're trying to. I'm always very suspicious of designers who will adopt any aesthetic given any
Right.
condition, because it suggests a lack of personal project in a way.
Yeah.
A lack of personal integrity. I know it sounds very strange, but I almost prefer designers who have a couple of best hits that they develop very early on,
Right.
and then they just continue to tinker with them, until eventually that model that they've generated loses relevance and something else replaces it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's really a kind of good way to answer your question.
I mean, that's interesting. I don't even know if I'm not even sure what my question was kind of in that. But I think that's interesting. And I kind of want to tie that to the Real Review and the types of writing that you are commissioning and kind of,
Sure.
What, I don't know exactly how to phrase this, other than just what are your goals for the publication, or what is the kind of discourse that you're trying to kind of jumpstart or enter into?
So there's really two audiences of the Real Review. There is the general audience, the general public, which make up. I mean, I'm process every single one of our subscriptions personally, so which is not a small number. I mean, we're up to a circulation now of about 6,000. So and more than half of those are subscribers. But I always take a great amount of care to see where those people come from. Often I will just randomly Google people to see what, to have a sense of who it is that I'm writing for. And what's really nice about a subscription publication is people will write to you directly, and you can then have a conversation with them. So you have quite a good sense of what has appealed to your readers and what hasn't appealed to your readers. Right. But in a way, there's a kind of general audience who you might call non-designers. They're people like doctors, lawyers, teachers. I mean, I've just named all professions, but there are, of course, non-professionals in there as well. We have subscribers who are cooks in Milwaukee, and really kind
interesting.
We have a guy who's a panel beater in an auto shop in Montreal. I don't know how he found out about the publication, but he's super into it. And that, at the same time, you then also have people like vice presidents of Condé Nast. We send issues to One World Trade Center, which gets me every time.
Interesting.
But in a way, and then of course you have really the architectural and mostly architecture and graphic design, with some other design disciplines in there as well, and they make up at least 50%, if not more. And actually, a good percentage are fashion designers as well. It's not clear to me precisely why that's the case, but that's kind of more or less the breakdown of the readership. But in essence, let's say the objective of the magazine is to do two things. One is to increase the exposure of, or to promote the idea of how ideology is expressed in space, and really to try and make sense of the contemporary in a way which is not just analytical or critical, but which is really propositional, and to explain the agency that we have as designers and the responsibility that we have. And I found a journal recently run by the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, SOAS, called the Journal of Material Culture. And I didn't know that material culture was the word that I was looking for, but that's what it is. They have great articles, things like, the role of the Air Max in the emergence of black culture, 1968 to 1992. Oh, wow. And then they'll analyze how there was a design feedback between, certain groups in society and certain material products. Or, the emergence of the British plug standard. I don't know if you've ever seen, but British plug is a really weird one. Yeah. So, in a way like this way of thinking about how anthropological and sociological questions, and often philosophical questions and cultural questions, are directly tied into the form of the material world around us, I think is very, very important to understand as designers, and for a long time has basically been not discussed. Right. So that's quite a kind of an important agenda. And the other is, there are so many interesting conversations going on within each of our design disciplines, but they are often quite inaccessible for people who are, particularly within the world of architecture, quite inaccessible for people who are not within that world. And so the idea is that to create a platform in which the pieces are interesting and assume a certain level of intelligence, but which don't assume a professional knowledge, and which are in effect written for universally for a general audience,
Right.
to try and also popularize these ideas within the public at large.
Yeah.
Which I think is super, super important.
I mean, that's something that I actually was really curious about talking to you about, and something I was interested in was about how you think about audience. And so it's actually really interesting to me to hear how many of your readers are not, directly working in design fields.
Totally.
How do you think about writing about these types of topics to people? This is going to be a two-part question. How do you think about writing about these types of topics to people that apparently have an interest in it but are not directly involved in it, while at the same time not dumbing it down or oversimplifying it for your readers who are very much involved in it?
Sure. I think the key to that is very strong editing and very strong clarity, really forcing clarity of thought, and in a way an economy of means. I mean, it should be written in a very simple way, but that doesn't mean that it has to be a very simple idea. And I think that's key. So, the avoidance of jargon, for example. I mean, there's all sorts of tricks that I learned working on a newspaper, like sentences should never be more than 25 words. Paragraphs should never have more than 4 sentences. Yeah. I mean, all of these kind of structures actually really help for the legibility, because Real Review, as you'll have seen, has a very dense text format. I mean, it's really long form journalism.
Yeah, it is.
And that, I think, can be quite intimidating to people if it's not written in a way which is very easy to read. So I think that kind of the role of the editor is very important in that. I can't remember what the other half of the question was. I'm sorry. In terms of how you make it relevant to
and then how do you make it so it's still interesting to
I think profession? The key to that is really to do with this question of the contemporary, because it has to be relevant. And I think if you can read the mood in the room 3 to 6 months in advance, that's the ideal, basically. Right. You need to be slightly ahead of the zeitgeist. And the thing about that is, of course, the more you study the times that we live in, the more you begin to see recurring patterns, the more you begin to see trends which are almost inevitable and long-term. Right. But it also means that you can avoid or because of the kind of lens that we look through, which is first of all the review, and second of all very much a kind of concentration on what you might call the politics of space or the politics of design. It allows you to avoid the cliche and provide things which are quite unusual and hopefully interesting. So, for example, there is not a possibility to write about the travel and immigration ban by Trump. I mean, what are the possible angles into that? I guess you can talk about the politics of security scanners, or you can, the actual material reality is very low. But once I started really researching how airports operate, and I discovered that all international airports are acclimatized to 21 to 23 degrees centigrade. It as a form of biometric control. Basically, that temperature, I'm afraid I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, but it's the lowest your body can be in temperature before it starts to feel cold and your metabolism slows down. So it lowers your breathing rate, lowers your heart rate. It's very calming. And they also have almost international standards about the removal of smells, the removal of trash, levels of cleanliness. I mean, all of these kind of operations, which in Britain at least are mostly coordinated by centralized computer systems. And it's the same computer system running the air conditioning and monitoring airflow and temperature that's also scheduling cleaning rosters. Yeah. So once you begin to understand that type of machine and how the temperature of the air is designed to calm all of these animals before they get inside steel tubes, that becomes in a way to address some of the discussion around let's say something like Trump's Muslim ban without actually addressing it directly. Right. And in the same way, we haven't covered Brexit. We haven't covered Trump directly because there hasn't yet been really, in the case of Brexit, any material outcome.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's very, and that, in a way, that concentration on the evidence of things is, for me, also it really focuses the mind. So hopefully, I guess what I'm saying there is, if you're very sensitive to the types of subjects which are very contemporary, but you're looking through this very precise methodology, hopefully you will find things which are relevant and interesting and contemporary and current, but which are also not another article about X.
Right.
And that I think is an attempt then to even present something which is unanticipated or unusual back to people within their own profession, something they hadn't thought about, or in a different way that they hadn't understood it before.
This is interesting, and I'm trying. I have a question that I'm afraid is going to sound oversimplified, or and I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it, but there's this interesting. I'm getting this kind of interesting shift in kind of how we talk about material culture or a building or something, where it could be I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but like a review of the building or writing about the building itself versus using the building or the object or the artifact to talk about larger things around it. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Completely. I think the way that I would understand that is, two of the philosophers there are three philosophers who've had a really huge impact on my mode of thinking and my way of viewing the world. They're all coincidentally French. One is Roland Barthes, another is Henri Lefebvre, and the third is Jean Baudrillard. And each one of these guys, in fact, rather coincidentally, Barthes and Henri Lefebvre were the dissertation supervisors for Baudrillard, but each of them deal with the same types of questions in a different way. So, Barthes deals with what he calls semiotics, or in a way, the kind of connotations of how images particularly are put together. So he would say, for example, you should give your kids wooden toys because they're abstract and they allow them to use their imagination, rather than like metal or plastic toys of things like fire engines or army planes, because they condition your child to think in a particular way. Right. And then you've got Henri Lefebvre, who says that ideology only exists in space. So he says capitalism is not some thing; it doesn't exist out there. It exists at the moment in which you take the money out of your pocket and give it to someone in exchange for the thing that you want. So in that sense, from the point of view of designers, what that coin looks like actually becomes a really radical political intervention.
That's so interesting.
And so the design of very kind of banal things, and then of course Baudrillard really talks about the image and reality, and that for me is a really important kind of distinction today, because we often become very confused as to whether we're looking at something which is real or something which is virtual, but often the virtual and the real have collapsed into each other, or in fact there is no meaningful distinction between them. So in a way, trying to understand these three thoughts, what it means is that when you look at something like a building, you can imagine it. These days, we would almost describe it as like an augmented reality heads-up display. When you look at a building, you are not just looking at a physical object in space. You're looking at all the forces and powers which created that building. Right. So you're looking at the almost like the precipitate, or the material residue of conflict between governance, between corporations, between finance, between different designers within the company, different product specializations, the facade manufacturer, the guys who make the air conditioning. And each one of these forces are so incredibly complex that there's almost no way to really know how they're going to come together until they form that building. Right. But that building then is really a material artifact. And you can do two things. You can look at it for what it is, but you can, in the same way that we go to like the historical ruins of Mexico or Guatemala, and we go and see these Aztec and Mayan ruins, or you go to Europe and you go and see these castles that have been inhabited for more than 1,000 years. These become in effect material artifacts which tell you a lot about the way that those people lived, what they thought was valuable in society, how they structured their societies. And you can do that for the contemporary as well. And in a way, the more, I think, what I would really like is, particularly with regards to power relations in the home, the more that people understand that these things are experiments and design projects and design objects, that there is nothing normal about tradition. There is nothing there is no such thing as convention, basically. Everything is an invention. And that once you understand that about the objects around you, you no longer have to take things for granted, and you can really change the way in which you decide to intervene. I mean, a kind of really rapid example is I was talking to my girlfriend about our house, and I said, it's very conventional, our house. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, there are many other ways that we could arrange our furniture in here. We live in a small flat because London is a very expensive city, and we basically just have 2 rooms, a living room and a bedroom, and then there's a very small kitchen, a very small hall, and very small bathroom. But it's effectively 2 rooms. I said, well, currently we've got the wardrobe and the bed in one room, and we've got the dining room table and the sofa in the other. What if we just put all the soft surfaces in one room and all the hard surfaces in another? I mean, what would that do to that experience of space? And of course, it didn't go down well because it was seen as a kind of weird utopian experiment. But in a way, the simplicity of that as an experiment is what I really appreciated. There is, and actually, to come back to Real Review, to give kind of OKRM their dues, part of the brief was to consider the page as a type of real estate, because the magazine, unlike a website, has a finite condition to it. There's only so many pages, and that forces a certain type of priority. But I said, it would be also really interesting to imagine in the relationship between text and image that there might be some 3-dimensionality to this. There might be some opportunity to, I don't know, flick back and forward, or even within one page somehow. I wasn't exactly sure what that would look like. And what they did was they basically took the machine which puts the horizontal crease in newspapers, and has been doing it for 150 years, rotated the sheet 90 degrees and put a vertical fold.
Yeah, so great.
Which is, for me, like the perfect representation of everything I'm trying to achieve with the magazine, which is, here's a system which has been used consistently in the same way for 150 years and you would think, therefore, that there is no possibility for innovation, alteration, and creating something new. But with with a very concentrated form of design thinking, a very, very small intervention can create something which has never been done before, because we've researched it quite extensively. I've not yet found another publication which uses the vertical fold as a design tool.
Yeah, no, neither have I.
So, and that gives me a huge amount of hope, because it's like, well, here's something where sometimes you feel, God, I don't know what I can contribute to this. I don't know if we need to design more chairs, or I don't know if we need to design more books. It just seems that everything is exhausted. Well, in a way, at that moment which you reach exhaustion, I think there's a great amount of hope in terms of saying, okay, well, in which case we have to think very laterally about this condition.
I love that you kind of connected that to the actual design of the publication itself, because as you were kind of talking about this idea of, everything kind of being this design experiment, and that's so much of what I love about the work that you're doing, and that I feel could very easily be translated into a graphic design profession, and all of the ways that you're talking about the built world, you could push all of that into talk about typography and logos and branding and all of this stuff. And I think so much of this podcast for me has been trying to articulate what is design criticism to me, or what is the type of design discourse that I'm interested in. And is kind of, I feel like, where I've settled in on, is that we can look at a company logo, and this brings it back to the Google article in a way. We can look at that formally and look at the kerning and the colors and the typography, or we can look at what is the system around that, and use graphic design to be a lens into the culture that surrounds it. And so I'm curious. So I was just kind of curious your thoughts around that as it relates to
my own
graphic
kind
design.
There's kind of two things that come to mind. The first is, when I was an architecture student, I had one professor who insisted that all drawings follow the same format. He only did square drawings because he said then there's no question of whether it's landscape or portrait. You have no ability to, let's say, consider the frame as part of the act of drawing. And you only can use the following line weights, and you can only use the following scales: 1 to 100, 1 to 200, 1 to 1000, 1 to 10,000. That was it. You can't use any other scales. And the reason for and every week you had a set list of drawings to pin up on the wall, 10 drawings. And the reason for doing this was that when you have so many differences between students, if you force them all to work in a consistent way, he once said to me one week, he got very angry with what I presented and said, I mean, look at the wall. Look at the wall. Look at what's on the wall. The writing is on the wall. And, he was Italian, so he didn't really understand the idiom. He really was speaking in terms of the fact that you can see the evidence is in the material, right?
Yeah.
You can, and so in that sense, I'm very interested when particularly when very intelligent people talk about very complex subjects. I always think to myself, like, show me the evidence, show me that this is the case, show me where this is taking place, show me even the hint of, these particularly futurologists working for people like Google. They talk about these miraculous visions of the world to come. And I always think, show me where that grain of thought has come from. Show me what leads towards that. Because if there is no material evidence, then I have to really question that.
Yeah.
There's a kind of, let's say, for my part, a real belief in modernity as the scientific method and empirical evidence. I think that's very important, and particularly there's been a lot of talk about post-truth. I mean, I think this in the long run will, not become a serious problem for us, because in order for Western modern society to operate, we require the scientific method and an ability to discern truth. So either post-truth leads to the total collapse of civilization, which I find kind of hard to believe, or let's say, virus is expunged and flushed out of the body.
Right.
But that's maybe a slight side point. The other thing I was thinking about more directly with graphic design is it's an act of mass communication, and that's and making, you spoke about how do you make these ideas, interesting to a specialized audience and to a general readership. It comes largely through the relationship I have with OKRM, the designers, and who are also partners in the publication. And we, this exchange around art direction, discussions of how to express ideas, how to make that clear, how to make that interesting, but also how to make it legible, and that but at the same time there are all sorts of other kind of sub discussions which come out of that. Like, on the one hand, we would say, well, of course, there were a lot of typographic experiments in London in the 1920s and 30s around legibility and the rise of sans serif.
Right.
And so, of course, the publication is written completely in sans serif, partly in nod to that. But on the other hand, if you typeset the whole thing in Helvetica or Arial or, Accident Grotesque or something, you would end up with an extremely homogeneous and lacking in real personality. And so the consequence of those two things, on the one hand, a desire for legibility, and the other, not to retain some humanistic quality, to not just lose your personality into a system, was a typeface designed by one of the designers at OKRM called Gestalt, which takes 5 or 6 different similar fonts and effectively redraws them and randomizes the order in which letter forms appear. So you'll notice, if you look really closely at the front covers of Real Review, on each issue, the R's, there are 3 variants of each letter, and the R's are always different. They appear in different places. That's easy because it's at large scale, but if you look closely, the ampersands, a lot of the punctuation differs quite radically, the quotation marks and so on, and it's such a minor detail that you don't really notice it. But you do feel is that while the publication has a certain homogeneity to it, it doesn't quite border on the banal. It doesn't look like a Word document, and that's because you pick up subconsciously these very, very minor alterations. And this, is, I guess, a good example of what I was saying before about how you have an ethic, you have a moral proposition, you have a kind of driving philosophy, and then you're looking for ways which express that. Even if they're, even if you're the only one who notices them, frankly.
I mean, I'm so embarrassed that I'm so mad that I did not notice that until you said that.
It's really subtle. I'm very,
so
very
mad
subtle
right now.
It's a very I've actually never had anyone notice it. Even professional typographers have not noticed it. So it's
secret's out now.
It's but that connection between the evidence, the means, and the ambition. They have to find, and that's what I think really good design is. I mean, the best design is when you can see someone had a clear intent to do something, and they've executed a thing which performs that role perfectly.
Yeah, for sure.
And that always makes me super satisfied when I see that level of design.
Yeah. I have two more quick questions that are kind of very specific, hopefully kind of short questions. As somebody who is kind of outside of the architecture world, who's kind of always looking into it, and so when I come to your work, I a little bit feel like an outsider, but I'm very much my design work is very much influenced by architecture, and even the way I think about my design writing and this podcast is very much influenced by the discourse around architecture. And I've always been jealous. I've talked to a couple architecture critics. I've always been jealous at the very theoretical and academic discourse that architecture has that graphic design doesn't seem to have as much or isn't as interested in. And so this first question, which I know I said these were specific and quick, this first one is actually a two-part question, but I'm interested in kind of how you think about that architecture discourse as it relates to graphic design, and as somebody who's maybe not as close, someone who's very close to graphic design but is rooted in architecture, can some of those things be brought into a graphic design discourse? And then the second part of that question is kind of very specifically, what are the kind of issues or the topics that architects are thinking and talking about right now?
The first thing to say about architectural theory, I suppose you might call it, is the reason for its existence is a huge insecurity on the part of our profession, because we originally kind of were considered, particularly in the Renaissance, as a meta art. So buildings, if you imagine kind of buildings from, say, the 1700s, particularly as we move into the Enlightenment, they were like ornamental things. They had incredible stonemasonry and paintings and tableau and beautiful ironwork or metalwork or brasswork or whatever, right? Mosaics and so on. They were really like composites of artwork. And so the architect was not actually a separate profession. It was just the master artist who assembled all of the works together. And so we still have some of that lineage. We still have this kind of aspiration to be like the great thinker who is able to assemble these different things into a coherent vision.
Yeah.
But the reality is that we work as a service profession, like every other design discipline.
Right.
And of course, at the level of the university, you have all of this legacy of architects who want to appear as if they are philosopher kings. But in fact, the discipline has no real use or interest in those. So they're constantly having to justify their own position. And to be an academic in architecture is to constantly justify your own existence. People really don't see them as being, or a lot of architects see them as highly suspect figures. And so there's a huge amount of stress and pressure to justify the idea of architectural theory. And that's why we get ever more extravagant in the references that we reach for. And we pull in Derrida and Foucault. We pull in, there was one architectural professor who once said to me, you can tell that things are going badly in architectural discourse when kids start reading books about why fish turn left. This idea of like swarm mentality, crowd mentality, how that might then be relevant to the programming of architecture. It's like you get really weird topics. And in a sense, the genius of architecture, and because of that lineage, everything appears relevant to architecture, to the architect. They say, well, the mechanics of how a flower opens, that's a kind of architectural question. Or they'd say the way in which battle fortifications in medieval Italy were designed to, reduce the damage caused by the invention of the cannon. That's obviously the dynamics and velocity of weapons. That's an architectural question too. And then you've got, the politics of space, whether or not an isolated housewife in her suburban home, that's an architectural question. There doesn't seem to be anything which isn't. And we just absorb everything in as a result. Whereas a lot of other design disciplines, they still kind of insist on the boundary of their own discipline. They say, well, this is graphic design, this isn't graphic design. Architects are like, graphic design, that's architecture.
Right.
I mean, I'm about to say it myself. I'm about to say, and that's precisely what allows me this fluidity to move between disciplines, because we can be like, well, I'm an architect, but I could be an artist, I could be a curator, I could be a graphic designer, I don't know, I'd be any of them. Problem is, of course, a lot of the time we don't do it well,
right?
But the desire is there, and I like that freedom of architecture, because on the one hand, it's very clear what you are. If you say you're an architect, it's a defined discipline, it's a profession even. On the other hand, it's kind of ambiguous because you could kind of be doing anything.
Yeah.
In terms of what architects are interested in at the moment, I mean, I think amongst particularly a kind of younger generation, so I mean, I'm 30, which by architectural standards is very young.
Yeah.
I have only one built building. That's pretty typical for someone my age.
Okay.
You become an architect very, very late in life. Most architects really achieve their fame in their 50s and 60s because it takes a huge amount of energy to convince someone to give you a budget of like $50 million and do a building. Like, who is conceivably going to buy that type of thing? It's crazy.
Right.
Of course, you go for the old guy who's been doing it for decades. And I'm jealous of other disciplines sometimes for the energy that youth has to be able to create things directly. But in terms of the change in the discourse, up until the 1970s, from the post-war period up until the 1970s, even early 80s, there was a very strong political tendency within architecture because we had been asked less so in America, but particularly in Europe by states which had been destroyed by war to modernize them. We were really asked to become agents of the state, and the state said, we need to rebuild our cities. But we're not going to rebuild them like they were before. We're going to modernize them. We want to bring all these modern amenities, new types of space, and so on. In Britain, most people had never had indoor toilets before the 1950s. I mean, you go back, it was really we forget how recently we lived in very primitive conditions. And so the architect took this on and, of course, then became very involved in politics as a result. But after the 1980s, they were very much discouraged from this, and they were really put back in their historical role as people who are apolitical. They simply execute the commissions that they've been asked to do. And that led to an entire generation from the late 80s through really till 2007 of architects who pretty much refused to examine any type of political or moral question. You have people like Zaha Hadid saying that there are claims that there are very high levels of deaths on her buildings that take place in the Gulf states. Right. And, she says, well, that's really not my concern, which is a fair enough point to make. And her other point was, if you start examining the morality of your clients, you can't do any projects because then it's like, well, can I work in China? Can I work can I work in Britain? Who is my client here? What's their intentions? Do I politically agree with them? And she says, well, no, you have to imagine that we're more like doctors. We perform a role in society. We perform a service, and we can't be judgmental about that. But of course, I think that abdication of that politics was hugely problematic. And what you have then is a generation which have graduated after 2007. So people from currently in their mid-40s through to really their early 20s, who are looking for a way in which architecture can regain some agency and begin to make more of an intervention politically, and to take more of a stand about what it believes. Because, as I was saying before, ethics and aesthetics are tied. The reason that we have so many aesthetic problems today in terms of the selection of style is because we don't know what it is we believe. We don't know why it is we're doing what we're doing. And if we have a very strong sense of purpose, those types of aesthetic questions resolve themselves.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I have one last just kind of quick question for you. I'm interested, this is kind of tying it back all the way to the beginning. I'm interested in this kind of dual role that you have as an architect and as a writer. And I'm interested in how those have influenced each other. How does being a writer or being someone who's publishing about architecture change how you think about the architecture work you're doing? And then vice versa, how does being a practicing architect influence how you write?
Well, I think it follows on completely from where I kind of concluded my last sentence, which is if you've ever got into an argument with someone who believes something quite different from you, often in the process of having that discussion and argument, you say things out loud which you believe, but you didn't know that you believed them before. Right. It's only in the process of you saying, well, actually, no, I think that everyone should have universal health care. And then someone says, well, what about this? And you say, I hadn't really considered that, but my opinion would be, and you give a kind of, an idea which must have been within you somewhere, but which you didn't know or hadn't expressed previously. The mistake that we make a lot of the time is we think we know what we believe. We think we know what we stand for. We think we know what our position is. We say, it's very simple. This is what I believe. But actually, the truth is that as soon as you begin to examine that, it can often have big holes in it. It can often have large unresolved areas. Right. And in a sense, the reason that I write is because I would like to know what I think about things. Yeah. And I use it as a way of developing my own, because if you have to write an argument that's going to be read by people, you have to do a decent job, and therefore you have to be coherent. You have to teach yourself to do that as well, which I think is a very useful exercise. Writing is probably the single most valuable, let's say, dimension to all the other work that I've ever done, because it allows you to structure ideas coherently for clients. It allows you to make a coherent presentation. Right now, for example, the way that I'm speaking is very much part of a process of training myself to always speak in whole sentences. You will often see, when you see people interviewed and then it's transcribed, they'll start a sentence and then they'll jump into another part of a sentence which has nothing to do with it. If you structure your thought the way that you write, it can be very useful. It's really about coming to a kind of form of precision and coming to a form of understanding of my own beliefs, in order then that I can, critique them, understand them better, develop them. And that can also come, I have to say, one of the reasons I like being commissioned to write for things is that someone will contact you with a very unusual subject that you've never given any thought before, and you have to rapidly come up with an opinion on it. And that, in a sense, is a really interesting conceptual activity, because that's also the way we work as designers. You spend years developing a portfolio in a particular region of design, and then a client comes and says, what have you I don't know, you spent 10 years designing lobbies to hotels, and then someone comes to you and says, we're thinking of doing a waste processing plant. What are your kind of thoughts on waste processing? It's like, you don't want to lose the client. You're like, actually, there's a lot of very interesting things going on in waste processing today. But in a way, that's the I didn't want to end with such a kind of banal example, but that for me is very much the relationship between writing and practice, or between, in a sense, thinking and doing. One which reinforces and refines the other.
That's great. I think that's like a perfect way to end, because that is exactly, I feel like, kind of the goal of this podcast for me, is looking at how those things can kind of influence each other. And you're someone who, very much, I feel like throughout this whole conversation, it's been very clear that you almost don't even see those as separate things anymore. They're so just part of kind of the work that you do. And so, like I said, I love the work you're doing. I love your writing. I love the Real Review. And I loved, having this time to talk to you. I thought this was such an interesting conversation. So thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very grateful that you would get in touch with me. And of course, it's a great privilege as well to be able to talk about your own work and to be able to discuss these types of ideas. So thank you.
This episode was recorded on May 11th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.